Leaked documents from trade talks show New Zealand has agreed to give foreign businesses the right to sue the government in international courts for policies that cause them financial loss. That's despite Australia's refusal to agree to the same thing in the 9-country Trans-Pacific Partnership talks. Our economics correspondent Nigel Sterling reports.
The government has so far refused to confirm its position on investor rights in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with the Prime Minister John Key even saying he thought it was unlikely that New Zealand would sign any agreement allowing foreign companies to sue it in overseas tribunals. But the consumer watchdog Public Citizen has been leaked a draft copy of the agreement which shows New Zealand has agreed to do just that. A lawyer with the Washington DC-based group Laurie Wallach says it leaves New Zealand in a vulnerable position.
The cigarette companies have threatened the smoke-free New Zealand policy, but it's not so easy to go after your laws. Why would New Zealand, who's one of the few countries that already isn't exposed to these attacks, consider newly subjecting itself to this threat?
The Green Party co-leader Russell Norman says creating special rights for investors could have a huge cost, both financially and in future governments' ability to regulate in the public interest.
Government is currently issuing a whole bunch of oil drilling permits in deep water. If we were to have a new government in 2014 that tightened the regulations around those oil drilling permits to try to make them safer, those oil companies could sue the New Zealand government in an international tribunal to compensate for the cost of the increased environmental standards.
Laurie Wallach says investor provisions had been common in past trade agreements, including in the North American Free Trade Area, or NAFTA, but their increasingly broad coverage means countries such as Brazil and India are now avoiding them.
But what they cover is the government takes your actual property and they take it because they expropriate it. There was none of this happy horseshit that's now in these agreements where you have a guaranteed minimum standard of treatment, which includes not undermining investors' expectations that regulatory policies won't change. Well, who the hell elected them? That's craziness.
Dr. Norman says New Zealand should follow Australia, which refused to include investor rights in its trade deal with the United States in 2004 and is again resisting them in the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
The fact that Australia is refusing to enter into this investor-state disputes mechanism should sound warning bells for New Zealand, and it's extremely foolhardy that the New Zealand government is continuing down the path of entering into this when the Australian government has said, no way, we're not going to do it.
A former Trade Minister, Jim Sutton, says investor-state rights haven't been a feature of New Zealand's past agreements. That's because New Zealand is seen as having a reputable court system where foreign investors can get a fair hearing. But the deal with China that Mr. Sutton kicked off did include them. He says they might be a good idea in the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
People were being asked to sign a provision which covers the situation and is probably pretty necessary in some cases. I don't think it's necessary for foreign investors in New Zealand, but it could well be necessary for New Zealand investors in other Trans-Pacific Party states at some time in the future.
But the Greens' Russell Norman believes if New Zealand companies like Fonterra tried to sue the US government, it would damage their interests in a number of areas, and so they wouldn't attempt it in the first place. For Morning Report, Nigel Sterling.